Welcome to our continuing series of stories about Pensacola, Florida, North America's first place city. And in our recent episodes, we've been telling the story of how Pensacola itself found its way through World War II. We're not talking principally about the war. There are lots of different ways to look at that and learn about it, but rather to kind of blend together events of the war and what was happening right here in the Five Flags City. Well, in our prior episodes, we had taken the story up to the year 1943. And of course, as we did that, we had talked through the highlights, or maybe we ought to call them the lowlights of the year 1942. This was the year in which we continued to have difficulties fighting the Japanese, and we were just beginning to make our way with the assistance and work with the British into North Africa. This was the time when the Battle of Midway was fought. And of course, so much exciting things happened there. And in North Africa, the Americans had just arrived. They fought their first battle, and this was not a success. This was what was known as the First Battle of Kasserine Pass, in which we were rather badly defeated. In the Far East, there was great concern at this point because we were fearful the Japanese might overrun Australia. And there was all sorts of defense measures being taken to take care of that. And of course, across the country, the people of the United States were coming to realize that the war was everyone's war. And we had to be part of preparing for it and taking care of day-to-day things. And that meant, of course, making food, recognize that food was a weapon. And that we had to grow a lot more food than we had in the past because we were not only feeding our own people, we were feeding our military people overseas, and we also were feeding many of our allies, particularly those that had been overrun by the Germans in Europe. But all of this was a part of the atmosphere in Pensacola at that point in time. And as we said in an earlier episode, our mayor, H.C. Hagler, and the members of the city council had done a wonderful job putting together the safeguards which the city should have in the way of wardens and prohibitions against problems downtown, and the very first rationing had been put in place as well. But then, as we got into March of 1943, tragedy struck the city because Mayor Hagler suffered a heart attack and he died. Fortunately for the population of the city, a very able bit of training had been done, and by the name of Walter Wicke, who had been a sort of a mayor pro tem, stepped into the role, and for the balance of the war, Mr. Wicke did a very fine job. At this point in time, of course, we had a very able set of public officials here. A man by the name of W.C. McCoy was our head of the county commissioners, and Howard Mays was the sheriff, and he again through the war years did a very fine job. Well, now let's think a little bit about what things were like in the city. Our city was very much as it had been through the entire Depression. The only exception that we had was that in 1940 a new federal building had been erected at the corner of Chase and Palafox Street, and that got a great deal of traffic as the war evolved. The other headquarters of our city and our county were the City Hall, of course, which was still in what we today call the T.T. Wentworth Museum, and the County Commission operated out of what we now call the old County Commission's headquarters at Palafox and Government Street. Things were going along quite well, but we were having to rely more and more on volunteers. Healthcare was a very fine example of that, because beginning almost within the first 90 days of our participation in the war, we had lost a great many of our medical staff, which, by the way, at the beginning of the war, we only had about 35 to 40 physicians all through the county, and about 1/3 of those men were in the reserves. So they were very quickly caught up for their service in the Army, the Marines, and a few of them in the what was then called the Army Air Corps. These men went off, and that left a tremendous void here. We had just the one hospital, that was Sacred Heart, and of course the people there were suffering the same problems because they were losing some of the nurses that they had on their regular duty staff, because these people also were reservists, and they were being picked up and carried off because nurses were extremely in need within the military service. And this was when People at the hospital love to talk still to this day about how volunteers, many of them women in their 40s and 50s who might have had business careers prior to that, they came forward, took quick training, and they became, they weren't licensed practical nurses or anything like that, but they were volunteer nurses, and all through the war, these people did a wonderful job. Now, if you look at the problems of the home, this is where the homemaker and of course the man of the house too began to really face up to some difficult problems, because there, with all of the things being needed for munitions and services and food and food substitutes, we began to have real shortages. For example, by the time we get into the early part of the spring of 1943, the ration book was part of everybody's family. People talked about that. Women across the back fence would talk about that, and the men over the coffee at the Child or the B&B, they would talk about how they were dealing with their ration book, because now we've now reached the point where many things that you used every day were being rationed. First, there was a limit to how much sugar you could have, how much fat you could have. The butter was practically non-existent in the community, and the companies that manufactured foods like Kraft and some of the others were now coming forth with all sorts of special recipes that the homemaker could employ that would use what they would call substitutes. And this was when pasta got a big lift here. Another thing that happened right at the early stage of our participation in 43 was that the men who were much involved in commercial fishing here were very upset, because on the national standard, the homemakers and so forth were not pushing fish as a regular menu item. So Francis Taylor and Frank Wells went to Washington. They put on quite a campaign along with some others, and they reversed all of that so that fish now became a big thing. Of course, the fishing fleet here, that was fine. They were ready to go out and do more business, but of course they had the same problem most employers did. It was very difficult to find men to fill the jobs on the boats. Something new that came into being about that time that it kind of has relevance here in the 21st century. It was at this point that some of the members of the local fishing community got the idea of catching shrimp and beginning to sell them to military commissaries. Now, in our time, it's very difficult to believe that shrimp were just not something that you ate across your normal table. The shrimp were bait. There are several different kinds of shrimp, and every one of them was thought to be good for this kind of fish or that kind. But nonetheless, you didn't eat them in a salad at home. But the men here in this community thought they would try an experiment, and they did. And the shrimp were tried out in the commissary here, served to military personnel and civilians here at the Naval Air Station. And people thought, hey, this is pretty good. So within a matter of months, the idea of catching more shrimp, putting them in refrigerated trucks, and sending them out as a menu item, this went off very well, and of course this was now being done up and down the East Coast, and it opened a whole new industry that of course remains with us today. Now, as we progress, we have to remember that how people got back and forth at this time. But intercity travel was not easy. We had buses. Of course, the automobile was available, but basically getting enough gasoline was very, very difficult, because unless you had special priorities and a coupon that allowed you to get more than the usual, you had to get by somehow or other on 4 gallons a week. And of course, back in those days, most of the automobiles that were on the road might average 12 or 13 miles to the gallon, and that was about the best they could have. So people relied on walking. There was a big trade in used bicycles, because people wanted anything that they could do to go back and forth to work. And of course, the one airline that we had servicing here, that was National Airlines, was flying 4 flights a day in each direction, and they were flying 12-passenger Lockheed Lodestar aircraft, and they did a land office business, even though we still had a very, very primitive airport. It had just been opened a few years, and once again, it was something that was doing something that was needed very badly here in our area. Another thing that, of course, was very busy at this time was the 2 railroads. Both the Frisco and the L&N were running trains back and forth, a lot of them carrying military supplies, and and they were extremely active. And of course, this was traveling by train. You did not need what you called a priority. Now, to get on an airplane in those days, you had to have a special, not only a ticket, but a priority that enabled you to get the ticket. So basically, this was a problem. So people traveled the trains, and I tell you, having had the personal experience several times in the course of those years, traveling by train was difficult because they were crowded, and it wasn't uncommon for men, particularly even military men, to spend the entire night traveling by train, sitting in the vestibule between cars. It was not a comfortable thing, but it did work. Well, the automobile, of course, many of the cars that we had here, they were old. Many of them had been bought and basically nursed, I guess that's a good word, through the entire Depression period. And we had just a handful of franchise dealers then that were doing the best that they possibly could to help people keep their cars in repair and on the road. And the names, of course, many of them are gone now. But we had the Pensacola Buggy Works, Malden Ford, Mitchell Motors that was handling Oldsmobile and Cadillac, Guy Yates and Son, they were the dealers for Dodge and Plymouth. Then these were people who were doing their very best to keep things rolling. Of course, alongside of that were men who had gone into the business of retreading or recapping tires. Because people, of course, the terrible shortage of rubber came about because the Japanese had captured most of the basic sources of rubber trees in the Far East. So people were nursing tires along in the best way they possibly could. Well, as this year passed by, of course, we moved into a brighter picture militarily. This was when we began to hear and read a little bit about plans for Operation Overlord. That the United States and Britain were going to invade Europe from the north, and this, of course, by the time 1943 was passed, Ike Eisenhower had been named to lead this, and we were moving on, of course, in all sorts of ways to try and prepare people for what was going to come in the future. We didn't know. It was difficult. We were seeing some more successes in the Eastern Theater, but the Japanese were a very, very obstinate opponent. And this is when you began to hear the stories about Bougainville and fighting in the Solomon Islands. We got stories back here, and of course, at that point in time, all our sources of information on this sort of thing basically were our newspapers, the one radio station, WCOA, that we had here, and of course, newsreels. Everybody loved to go to the movies in those days, and the newsreels that they saw were part of the entertainment, but also that's what kept you alert to what was going on. People in our community, of course, were trying to keep in touch with being good hosts, because by this time we were training a great many European aviators to be, many of them coming from Great Britain, and many of the churches just got very deeply involved in being a kind of a host site for these men. I can tell this one story of the Presbyterian Church in downtown Pensacola, where a school teacher, a Latin teacher named Kathleen Monroe, who was in her middle ages, which she just took upon herself to be part of a hostess group, and they would bring these young men in and do nice things for them at the church, and it worked out just fine. But in later years, long after Miss Monroe was gone, though many of the men who had been trained here put together a plaque in Britain and mailed it to the church, which the plaque still hangs on the wall there, recognizing what was done here in those days. So as we pass through the year 1943, it's a brighter time. Pensacola is looking good. People are being entertained. We're still getting, the men are still enjoying the accounts of Major League Baseball, which came to them daily in the newspapers. We had many fine movies that attracted people because we still had our motion picture theaters open. This is when such films as Casablanca and Mrs. Miniver, Winston Churchill once said that the film Mrs. Miniver was as good as having 2 additional divisions to fight for him. It was so good to support the morale for his people. So basically, that was pretty much what was happening to us. The war was moving on. Things looked a whole lot brighter by the time we were coming to the end of 1943. Our local industries were doing well. The shipyard was functioning, and we were in hopes that we were going to win this war, and it might even be over in the year 1944.